All right. Then I think we are prepared to primarily let the young people, members in the audience. Oh, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question to Mr. McLaren. Hi. I was just wondering, why do you believe that it's so important to find, to explore Gackel Ridge, and what do you think we will gain from that?
That's an absolutely wonderful question. I couldn't have given you a better question to ask me. I think I planted it without knowing it, but the Gackel Ridge is the slowest seafloor spreading area in the world, just on the order of a couple of millimeters, maybe a year. But it's remote, under ice, and it's certainly determined it's tectonically active. I think Woods Hole, nobody's been to actually look at it, but there's every indication there's there's smokers and a lot of activity going on down there. And so my objective is to prove there's ecosystems surrounding each of these black, gray, white smokers, and living on chemosynthesis. And then this increases the probability of discovering the same thing on the moon of Jupiter, Europa, or Ganymede, or maybe even Titan, the moon of Saturn. And so this is my holy grail. I'm trying to get a submersible built that'll, all I need is $4 million, and I think probably the money's just residing right here. I'll stand at the door and collect it as you go out. But we can get the submersible built in 16 months, proof of concept, and then I'd like to make the dive to Europa. I just have to live to 140 years, and so I know you're very physically fit in Sweden, so I'll be interested in your tips.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
There's another very important reason to study Gackel's Ridge, and that is that there's evidence that there's explosive volcanism there. And the volatiles that cause those explosions are significantly, have a significant carbon dioxide content. One of the things we really don't understand about our planet is how much carbon dioxide is coming out of the planet from natural sources. And here we have an example of a spreading ridge where the traditional wisdom was that there's basically no extensive volatiles coming out, and yet there's this strong evidence that's recently been reported in Nature. So it becomes a very exciting place to look for geochemical as well as biological evidence.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. So now let's open this up to questions from primarily the young audience to anybody here. Yes, please, on the first row.
This question is for Professor Hemley. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but I was wondering with the hydrogen systems that you were talking about, if sort of what macroscopic behaviors you observe. Do you observe phonons or anything of that nature propagating through the system? Or is it more on the smaller scale with these vibrons and other degrees of freedom?
Well, we measure bulk properties, so we're measuring the vibrational spectra, the optical spectra, the conductivity of the bulk solid and the fluid. So in that sense, they're macroscopic, but we're probing in many cases molecular length scales, if that helps. So they're phonons, but they're also extended excitations in the solid or the fluid.
Thank you.
Anybody else like to comment on this? Or fine, okay.
This is a question for Professor Hooft from one of our young people who were finalists in the Molecular Frontiers Inquiry Prize. They ask, is there anything such as true randomness in nature? And if not, how do you reconcile that with the Heisenberg identity principle?
Well, there's something very special with the theory of quantum mechanics. When we interpret a quantum calculation, there's always a random element in the prediction of an experiment, and there is a deterministic element. So, for instance, you can do an experiment on particles, and You can predict in high precision what kind of things may happen, what kind of things may not happen, but you cannot predict absolutely exactly the outcome of an experiment, because there's always some random distribution there. And that is inherent in a theory of quantum mechanics that dates back to the origin of the theory when Born had discovered the interpretation of the wave function, that there is a probabilistic interpretation. Something may happen, something may not happen, and a wave function tells you what the probabilities are. But then quantum mechanics also dictates that these are very strict predictions of the probabilities, including the correlations. And basically all that is left after you know the wave function is randomness. And so in a sense, to my mind, quantum mechanics is the perfect theory of randomness. Now, I don't really believe that randomness will always be perfect. So my suspicion is that at the root of all this so-called theory of everything, there's no longer randomness, but there is determinism. That is to say, laws of nature dictate precisely what happens, but very often the result of such laws is so complex that although the laws are precise, we will never be able to make sense out of the outcome of the observations, and so we will interpret that as random. For instance, if you have a gas of molecules, the molecules behave randomly in the gas. It's impossible to predict in advance where any particular molecule will go in the gas. It's hopeless. It's far too complicated. So that is a randomness. And there's a great deal of such randomness in the universe. Every gas, every complex substance contains very high degrees of randomness. But then always there's also some order in there as well. So, and actually I find the most interesting domains of physics is where order meets randomness. You have random elements in behavior of some substance, and you have systematic behavior, such as water turning into ice, and the molecules of water in the ice. They show some randomness, but they also show some very precise laws about how they are distributed. And it's always in these interfaces of randomness and order where interesting things happen. And I think that also holds for life and more complicated branches of science where, for instance, there are many living substances, think of plants, where the leaves of the plants grow more or less in random positions. Nevertheless, of course, the internal structure of a leaf is also very much ordered. So if you look at a tree, the tree looks very ordered, but every single branch and leaves are random. And you see that situation occurs most often in physics, and that in many cases that leads to very interesting structure. I don't know whether this answers your questions, but I made some.
I'd like to comment on this as well. I've been troubled by the use of the word complexity in what I think are very different ways. There's no formal scientific definition of complexity, or rather there's maybe 20 or 30 of them. But the complex system that's described in terms of the interface of water becoming ice and this kind of interesting boundary is very, very different from what most biologists would think about in terms of a process where you have a system with combinatorial richness over which selection acts for very long periods of time. To me, the kind of complexity that most of us would think of when we see a natural system, such as those of us in this room thinking about these questions, really is partly there's a non-quantifiable aspect of patterning, of just interesting behaviors. And these systems take very long periods of time, as I say, combinatorial richness, and a selection mechanism, which we generally refer to as complex evolving systems. And so this is very different from the neg entropy idea that sort of has been implicit in some of the questions coming in. I think we have to agree that there's a distinction. That's all.
Anybody else in the audience? There's somebody here?
Okay, it was also just a physical question about the general structure of the atom. You said that it was the shape of the electron orbitals were sort of dumbbell shaped, and I was told that it was sort of the eigenvalues of some of functions. I was just wondering, what are the fundamental functions that you base quantum mechanics on? Is it classical mechanics, or is it just what is the basis?
It's the Schrodinger equation, which is the fundamental equation of quantum objects. Actually, the true equations are very, very complex. Complex now in the sense of being complicated. That, in fact, when you have an atom, there are tens or even sometimes hundreds of electrons active in that domain, and the equation controls the behavior of every electron, knowing the position of every other electron. So you can imagine that if you consider hundreds of particles, how tremendously complicated those equations actually are. But now those orbitals that you talk about tell you what the equilibrium situation is. And usually that means that you have a configuration with a very well specified amount of energy. Very often we consider the lowest possible energy, and we ask for that particular configuration of electrons around atoms which has the lowest amount of energy. And that is an eigenvalue of that Schrodinger equation with the lowest, or the eigenvector of the Schrodinger equation with the lowest possible eigenvalue. And that's a differential equation which you can try to solve, and usually you need rather complicated mathematics for that. But then you find these equations, they show lots of interesting non-trivial structures. So you get indeed these orbitals, they are called in chemistry, of the electrons around an atom. Now, the electrons also show an exclusion principle, which tells you that no two electrons may sit exactly in the same physical state. Well, sometimes they only differ by their spins, and so apart from spin up and spin down, two electrons can be in the same state. But then it's not more than two electrons which may sit in the same state besides their spin. And then, so when the first electrons occupy the simplest possible states, the remaining electrons have to sit in more complicated states. And these states have many bellies and valleys in between, so they are wave-like patterns. So they automatically generate these complicated wave-like patterns. The more electrons you've got, the more electrons sit in the more complicated orbitals, which means that the atom gets a quite complicated structure that way. And I use that to at least indicate the reason why, say, the water molecule is so strange, that the oxygen is not just between the two hydrogens, they form a particular angle. And that's because the electrons in the whole system obey these complicated equations. Oxygen, something like 8 electrons, and then the 2 electrons of the hydrogen makes 10, if I'm not mistaken. So you have 10 electrons. The first of these take the simple orbits, but then the others take more complicated orbits, and then you have to ask which configuration of the nuclei is such that the total energy minimizes, and that's the generic shape of that molecule. So you see, this is a result of solving rather complicated mathematical equations.
I'd like to follow up with that, if I may, because that's a very, very good point, and one of the points I wanted to make in my talk was that when we take collections of atoms and put them under extreme conditions of very high density, then we shouldn't be thinking about them in terms of the isolated atom wave functions that describe systems under normal conditions. One needs a much more complicated wave function, and even when you separate them as single electron wave function components, your basis set may be very different, and that's why you can get this bizarre behavior that looks so different than a normal atom under ambient conditions, say turning a metal into an insulator and an insulator back into a metal.
Thank you. I think Felicia has a question.
Yes, a Mars-related question, so whoever feels obliged to answer. There's been talk and some preparation of doing a one-way trip to Mars, which might partly be funded by doing a reality show of all of it. What are your thoughts on this, and would you consider going on a one-way trip to Mars?
Yes. Maybe, should we let Laurie start with this?
Let me comment. I think I'd like to have sent 3 of my 4 kids to Mars.
Laurie, do you have... Can we have a microphone here also?
You follow up. All right. So does that work? Okay. Yeah, I think we all know some people we wouldn't mind sending on a one-way trip to Mars. So yeah, I mean, I think it's been really interesting in Mars One. Who had the Mars One slide? Who was that? Okay, yes. They had, 78,000 people sign up or something, I mean, and they raised $2 million in a very short period of time. It's quite interesting to see the level of interest. To me, this is a good thing for future space exploration if we have this many people who really are that passionate about it that they would sign up. So we ought to be leveraging that like crazy. It is clearly politically non-viable for a government-sponsored mission to be a one-way trip to Mars, unless it is absolutely a part of a widely accepted plan to settle there. How long does it take to get there? 6 months. It's not bad. So it's not so hard to get there, it's harder to get back. It's actually harder to land once you get there. It's pretty easy, and another group is talking about sending a married couple, you'll all love this, on the round trip, not to land, but to just swing by the planet and come back. I talked to my husband about being trapped in a tin can the size, not much bigger than a Soyuz, for a year and a half, 2 years with your spouse. That'll be fun. And yeah, I mean, as much as you love them, of course I love my husband very much, but yeah, you really have to. So that's actually relatively doable now, I would say. It's the landing of the massive systems that it takes to support humans on the surface is extraordinarily challenging on Mars. So landing Curiosity, which is about a 1-ton rover, was a huge leap from the previous thing we'd landed, but it's not even remotely close to what it would take to land humans. Something 40 to 100 times, I think it is, the mass. And we honestly don't have we don't know how to do it yet. We don't have the ability. So we're far from it, but it's something we could do if we decided, but we're pretty far from it. So it's an interesting discussion, though. I have to say I'm really happy to see all of this entrepreneurial activity around space exploration. I think it's good for space exploration and good for government-sponsored space exploration to be driven as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the philosophy of the whole enterprise is to use as much as possible only existing technology, and to have it a commercial, have only commercial firms participate, not government funded agencies.
And again, to do that, going to Mars and back without landing is possible, just barely, yes. I would say.
Indeed, the landing is indeed technically the most difficult part. So once you cross out the return trip, then that's the most difficult. Otherwise, it would be returning from Mars, which would be an order of magnitude more complicated and require much more development costs and so on, and also time to be able to realize that. So this was, but then people ask the question, why should you want to return? You might not even be able to return physically because your body has adapted to 1/3 or 1/4 of the gravity of Earth. So it's very difficult to go back to Earth gravity after that. The body might have deteriorated too much. But yeah. So you can survive on Mars but not come back. And the idea of some people is, well, this is what we actually want. You want to establish a colony on Mars which can expand mostly by its own force, not entirely perhaps, but as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Leroy?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think my biggest congratulations to Mars One goes to the fact that they were brilliant to charge an application fee and raise $2 million. That was brilliant. However, this is not a new idea. People have been talking about, mostly academic discussions about sending a colony to Mars, and of course there have been many science fiction books written with that premise. But in a practical sense, people have made comparisons to Lewis and Clark expeditions, things like that. But Lewis and Clark could take for granted that they would have oxygen and water, and that they would have game to hunt for food. And of course, that's not true going to Mars. Existing technology does not yet exist to go land people on Mars and sustain them living off the land. Even if you could find enough water to sustain and generate enough power to sustain electrolysis units, I mean, you've got to protect for failures. If your system breaks down for a little while and you don't have enough oxygen, then the experiment is over. So, again, I congratulate them for their ingenuity on raising money and for stimulating discussion. I think the same with Inspiration Mars. Congratulate Dennis Tito for kicking that off and stimulating discussion. But frankly, if I were to put money on this, I would say neither one's going to go to Mars.
Well, maybe I just respond. The question of life support in principle can be answered. So they investigated all these questions and found that most of them, in principle, have been answered by modern science. You can grow plants with the things you have available there, and you can make air. There is enough water in principle. It can be made. So these questions can all be answered. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we can go there tomorrow, but at least much of the technology might be available in not too distant future. So
yeah,
there seems to be no very fundamental obstacle there.
No, I don't disagree.
I think the landing was mentioned, was the most difficult part.
I don't disagree that the principles have already been figured out, and it's the application, it's the devil's in the details and the engineering. So I guess that's why I say I think it's a good academic discussion. There are no showstoppers, not technology, but science-wise. We understand how to do these things. The devil will be in the engineering details, which we haven't done.
Okay. Since I'm the NASA employee up here, I was talking to people in the space technology, and they actually disagree that they don't think the landing is so bad because, you're dealing with at least a little bit more atmosphere than you are on the moon. That the big issue is the human factors, the increased risk of cancer and various other damage to your body, not once you're there, but in transit both ways. And so that to at least some people at NASA is the big showstopper. In terms of the mass that you bring up, I tell my students, in the business, mass equals money. So the more you bring up, I think the number that Leroy used this morning was $20,000 for a pound. I usually use $10,000 for a can of Coke. It's roughly the same. Depends how big a bottle of Coke, whether you live in New York or not, I guess. So what we're doing in my lab and a few others is addressing the issue of the upmass and how you live off of the land. When the settlers came over to the Americas, they didn't bring their homes with them. They built them. When people moved west, they didn't, again, bring their homes and everything with them, and the size herd that they would have eventually, you bring some breeding animals and you build your own homes. There's no reason we shouldn't be doing that on Mars. When you go to the moon, you can pretty much pack a few sandwiches and, live out of your spacecraft for a few days. Anyone can go camping for a week or two as long as the people you're with are fairly reasonable. But it's totally different when you're talking about 2.5-year round-trip mission, 6 months either way, and then about a year and a half when you're there. And so we've proposed using biology, in particular aided by synthetic biology, to help do this. So we've had projects, for example, where we've engineered microbes to precipitate calcite or to produce glues, and then you can take the surface of Mars and build bricks. Once you can build bricks, you can build buildings and have a very lightweight shield in it. There's no reason you can't take the CO2 from the atmosphere and the nitrogen and turn it into usable compounds. Perhaps someday print a steak if you want one, or an apple, or a new organ, or various other biocomposites. So we're working on all that sort of thing. It's not that there aren't people doing some of this technology on the Earth as well, but once you apply that to human settlement off the Earth, you have a very powerful tool.
Yes, here please. Can you send the microphone back? It's coming. Can you say your name also before you ask the question? Yes.
Brans Nyberg.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is a question to someone who feels they could answer this. But at least Dr. Laurie Leshin, you mentioned that there are organisms on Earth that use other kind of chemical reactions than respiration to get energy. And my question is, which molecules are involved in? Can you give examples of these different reactions and which molecules that are involved to make these chemical reactions? And but depending on the answer, what potential is there for us to get to use this energy?
My colleagues here. I was going to say, you got yourself into it now. No. You guys are the experts right down here.
Yeah, of course. Yes, there are, of course, always redox reactions, chemical reactions. For example, hydrogen, if there's hydrogen, and there is hydrogen, what I heard. And so if there's sulfur, for example, hydrogen can be oxidized and sulfur can be reduced without any oxygen in the atmosphere. And there are more and more reactions like this. It's just an example. I will talk about this tomorrow in my talk for the high temperature organism, but the same is true at least for some cases at ambient temperatures. Yeah.
Anybody else would like to comment on this?
Can I throw a question to my colleagues here?
Great.
How about the idea of human engineering people that are better, that would be better adapted for making an excursion to Mars?
Engineering a human who would be better adapted?
Exactly.
There's actually a student who shows up at my office about every other day who insists that he's going to make a photosynthetic human. And I thought I'd escaped him by coming to Sweden, but apparently he's right here.
He called me.
I thought so. And maybe other people here have different feelings, but I feel very uncomfortable about making irreversible changes in people. You know, again, I don't worry much about something like putting on glasses because I can take them back off at the end of the day. So along those lines, a colleague of mine who is our chief medical officer at Ames. Well,
and knee replacement.
but you're doing that because you want something better. Anyway, what he's doing, for example, is making implants that are reversible. So you could inject hormones or whatever, but again, it's microencapsulated, so it's completely reversible. And now you'll get completely different opinions, I'm sure.
Well, that's something I hadn't really thought much about. It's an interesting idea. I know that Scott Carpenter wrote a book many years ago, fiction book, by the way, about, I think it was Scott, about kind of along those lines, but it was not so much for a space application as more of a kind of a military application. And who knows, maybe that kind of work is going on. But as we see more research, and as we touched upon this morning, more and more things being looked at in genomics, you know, who's to say what's going to be possible in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And, you know, of course, the bioethicists will have to weigh in and figure out what would be the right things to do. But certainly, I would say, technically, it's going to be possible to do some of that work.
So I really was struck by something that Leroy talked about this morning, which is as we get better at understanding the fundamental mechanisms behind some of the ways that humans have challenges to stay for long periods in space or to go to other worlds, we will also find ways to select through screening those who are better suited to adapt well to it. And I think what we're more likely to see, well, then there's that. And are more likely, I think what we're more likely to see is that screening become more common. So if, for example, certain people's bodies can more rapidly repair radiation damage, well, those people would be naturally well suited to go on long space journeys. And I can imagine something like that happening, that people, before they would decide to go live in the Mars colony, would find out whether or not they're particularly well suited to it.
I have one question here. Do you have a microphone, please?
Yeah, I have the microphone. I would like to, some of these topics I think are very suitable to elaborate on in tomorrow's panel. So I think we should...
I think we take...
one more question.
One question, yeah. Okay, we had one in the back also. What do you feel like today or tomorrow? Yes, I think you raised your hand, right?
We both had questions.
Okay.
But Destiny has the microphone.
Yes, so let Destiny go, yes.
Okay, hi, I'm Destiny Andrews. I was wondering, more directed toward Dr. Leshin and Dr. Jørgensen, how you were saying that the when you heated the rocks on Mars, they expressed like water and stuff, and I was wondering if that was related to your work with the prebiotics and the water being in the formation of the different planets.
Yeah, so questions about where the planets get their water are really important when you try to think about the history of life and the possibility of habitability. If you just if you take a handful of the sun and start to cool it down, and you can imagine that eventually you will there's oxygen and there's hydrogen, and in the right conditions you will make water. So there was water around in our early solar system, and I think your work shows there's water around in lots and lots of early solar systems. But the question of exactly then how that gets put into planets, whether it was the last question I think you answered about whether it forms sort of small ice mantles on grains, which then get accreted into bigger and bigger things and eventually become part of planets, or whether it's largely delivered later through cometary impacts and such, is a question of really active research today. It's a very interesting thing, and things like the deuterium to hydrogen ratio, the ratio of the different isotopes, can teach us a bit about the origin of that water and where it comes from. So it's in fact some measurements that we make on Mars to try to understand that. There's some data that suggests that the primitive water on Mars had a deuterium to hydrogen ratio that's more similar to comets than even Earth's. So it's very interesting as we think about these things.
I have nothing to add to that.
Maybe one of us. So let's take the questions in the back also now. Raise your hand clearly so she can see you. Yeah.
I had a question for Dr. Chiao. You mentioned that the food brought up to space, the military food, wasn't the best for space. So I was wondering what would be better and why isn't that type of food brought instead?
Well, the reason that we bring the food that we bring is because it's very stable. It can be left in room temperature for a very long time. So for the military, that's obviously something that's very desirable, and also for a space mission. Now, the composition is what is not so desirable for space. So if we could manufacture the same food, but do it without the added fat and all the added salt, then that would be much more ideal for space flight. However, that would be very expensive, and so for 6 months, it was thought, probably correctly, that we can deal with that for 6 months. Now that we know that it may be a factor anyway in causing some of these problems, that's something that's being looked at. Not that there's a plan right now to go replace the food, but it's just being studied to see if it is a factor, and if it is a factor, how big of a factor is it, and does it warrant going out and making custom food? Because right now the most important thing is to have calories and the food available that's going to not spoil over the course of the mission.
And the salt is a preservative, right? I mean,
Right, and the salt also
so
adds as a preservative, sure.
So can I say one thing? Yeah. So there are actually people who are food scientists at Johnson Space Center, where Leroy flew out of or was based, and I've eaten lunch in there a couple of times when I've done various visits. They'll serve you lunch. It's very disconcerting to be served lunch by someone in a lab coat. It's not something I recommend, but they have wonderful food scientists who are working on these things all the time. So if that's an area of interest, even a food scientist can go work for NASA.
Thank you so much.
I think your neighbor also has a question in the back there.
Hi, my name is Rayhan, and I had a question for Dr. Leshin. You mentioned that you had found traces of water on Mars, but I was just wondering, do you think that an organism from Earth would be able to survive in Mars and adapt itself if it were to be planted there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think so. Clearly, the environment that we are sampling in the rocks in Yellowknife Bay, where we've drilled our holes, are sampling we don't know exactly how old they are, okay? But they're probably 3.5 billion years old, so they're quite ancient. So at the time when those rocks were deposited, I have no doubt that a terrestrial bacteria, some kind of organism, would be perfectly happy swimming around in that water. And that's why we call it a habitable environment. Could something live there today on its own? I think that's a lot tougher. So one of the things, and again, Lynn, I think mentioned this, that we've done research into, how do you build a greenhouse on Mars? Because clearly we'd need to do that. The soil is probably okay, but we'd probably need to add nutrients and add liquid water as well to make it suitable. And then over time, you have to worry about some of the radiation environment as well.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add anything to that?
Okay.
You're much more an expert than me. I studied.
Do you have a microphone?
Some work in the era before there was Google, and so it doesn't count anymore, on organisms living in salt crusts and evaporites, and actually predicted at the time that something could live in an evaporite there. There are really three questions that you're asking. Can something originate on Mars? And probably the answer is yes. could something have survived in the past? And I think Laurie answers probably yes. And then the question is, could it survive now? And I could put something up there from my lab right now that could survive in a salt crust, which attenuates a lot of the UV, and some various other places in the rocks and so on. How long it would survive, there's another matter. There's only so long you can go if you're in a dehydrated state because you're still being damaged by radiation and so on. And so eventually, if you don't ever rehydrate and undergo cell division, repair, and so on, you're out of luck.
So isn't the real question, can something live on Mars that can actually procreate, can expand by its own force?
Okay. The other answer is that there's a little bit of a cultural problem because a lot of the people who talk, no, nothing intended against you, Laurie, but a lot of the people involved in this business are geologists. And so they look for global oceans and so on. Karl and I, for example, are microbiologists, and 100 microliters is a global ocean to a microbe. So when these people call me from JPL and say, what would you really like, Lynn? I'd just say, just give me 100 microliters of liquid water and I will be happy. I think I've even gone down to 50, when I'm desperate. And they said, well, yeah, I bet we could probably find a fluid inclusion somewhere. I said, that's all I need. That'll make me happy. So I think when we get down into that level of resolution, if someone can find us 50 or 100 microliters of liquid water somewhere, then we're back in business.
But surely there are deep environments where that obtains.
Probably deep environments. If there are any fluid inclusions in the ice caps, there are periodic rain and so on. So, my understanding is that Lloyd's of London stopped taking bets on whether there's life on Mars about 10 years ago. And so that's good enough for me.
One follow-up. One thing that's come from studies of very extremophiles is that there can be very, very long lifetimes. That is very, very slow turnover. So they call it life in the slow lane for maybe centuries. So there could be sort of a suspended state, and we might not recognize that as life.
Right. The problem is, I think that, in the mid-latitudes, the sort of thing that Phil Christensen was talking about, we're talking about 10,000 year. And that's totally different. So, for example, we've done some work on tardigrades, which are water bears, and you've probably read about them. In fact, there's a Swedish group that flew them in space. And they're great. Once they dehydrate these little things, they can undergo practically everything short of a nuclear winter. The problem is, how long can you go in a dehydrated state? Now, fortunately, they dry on things like plant samples. So if you go to herbariums, and again, perfect country if you're talking about it with Linnaeus, that these are usually extremely well dated. So you can go to a herbarium sample from 100 years ago and rehydrate a tardigrade and be okay. When you get to about 150, you can rehydrate them, but they're not up for sex, they're not up for reproduction. And we could make follow-up comments about that, but the point is that they're no longer reproductively active. And so there's a huge difference between 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, and 10,000 years, and that's what I'm concerned about.
Right.
That we're going to do this experiment because we've sent things to Mars that are full of terrestrial microbes.
You want a microphone, please?
So someday, we clean them very well, and there are standards to clean them. And when we have things like our SAM experiment, where we're specifically detecting organics, we made sure the end of that arm is really, really clean. But the rest of the rover has stuff on it. It has stuff that catches a ride from Earth. So someday we'll go back and swab these things, I have no doubt, and sample it and see what has happened to the terrestrial life we brought with us.
There's two more questions from the internet that just came in. Maybe they're very relevant to this. Last ones, right? Yep. So I'll combine them into one question. The question is, why is water so important to life? Why no other molecule can allow the process of life to be taking place? And the corollary to that is, why no non-carbon-based life forms? Why don't we look at silicon and other things?
Is there any way we could wait till tomorrow? Because that's
absolutely
3 of my slides.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Otherwise, I can just give up and not give a talk.
No. We'll wait till tomorrow.
Okay.
Well,
where is the last question? Okay, please.
You talk about colonizing Mars, but is it possible to find life, any form of intelligent life somewhere else in space, or is it too big for us to find it?
I can comment on this one. There's a very active program you may have heard about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the SATI program, where actually people are looking out with large radio telescopes and searching for signals there. So it's definitely something that's feasible. The question is just there's a lot of places to look. So it's a question of time.
I'd like to go as probably the only plant biologist here, back to the previous discussion. Actually, the distance between an organism surviving on Mars and actually establishing colonies is quite profound. And I think that I'd like to remind people of the biosphere disaster, because what the biosphere was built to create a completely, based on the state-of-the-art knowledge at the time, create a complete ecosystem. And one of the things probably the most celebrated downfall of that was that the concrete absorbed more oxygen than they expected, so they went into oxygen deficit and had to unseal the structure. But what doesn't get much attention is how hard it was for them to actually grow the food. And they had sunlight and water. What they didn't really understand well enough is that every seed and every biological organism that they brought in brought its own population of both bacteria, fungi, insects, and so forth. So basically, they struggled to survive because they didn't understand that agriculture, it was itself a complex ecosystem. Pardon?
Yeah. Well, I think we have, we need to move on because time is getting a little bit late. So I think we've heard, so thank you so much, all panel members. I'll let you...